All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 18th, 1984, a lone gunman walked into a McDonald's in San Isidro, California, armed with a semi-automatic pistol, a semi-automatic rifle, and a shotgun. He began shooting and killing 21 restaurant patrons and workers in what was then the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. Nearly half of the victims were under 21 years old, 5 were under 12 years old, 1 was 8 months old. The event made the news, obviously. It shook the country, and in some ways, in that moment, felt new. But so many of the factors and details in the story don't feel new anymore, and they feel very relevant to so much of the gun violence that we encounter seemingly every week in this country now, as are the political and policy dimensions to this story. So here to discuss all of that are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
And our guest for this episode is Cari Babitzke, lecturer at Boston University, a researcher on gun violence and gun politics and the NRA and lots of the other issues around this. So, Cari, thank you so much for joining us on this.
Thanks for having me.
There's a policy conversation here. There's lots of big things to get into. I just wanted to sort of say that this morning I was looking around. Sometimes I go and look for like podcast episodes about some of the topics we discuss, and I was just sort of searching for this. And, you know, there are dozens and dozens of podcast episodes about the San Isidro Massacre, and they all are no surprise in that like really schlocky true crime kind of like salacious listing the gruesome details and so forth. And so, Cari, I don't know, I guess I'm not surprised or am surprised. I was just like, wow, you know, like what has this story become and what have we forgotten about this story? And so, Cari, I'm just curious if you think about when we just can start there with just like this is an act of violence and how it's lived in the public imagination, and maybe we can talk about some of the things that have been forgotten or not talked about and some of the ways it has really turned into kind of just another true crime story.
Yeah, you know, it's always fascinating to think about how these events live in public memory, right? I mean, I went back this morning before we were getting ready to speak, and I went back and was looking through some back issues of some magazines. I have American Rifleman here at home, and I have some other magazines as well that I just kind of keep on hand. And I didn't see mentions of it really in any of those issues. And so it makes me wonder, you know, you think about the news, of course, of the time certainly covered the event. You know, my partner, he's a bit older than I am. And so he of course, remembers it as a public event. But I think that when we think about how we commemorate these sort of acts, there is a kind of public commemoration of acts of violence, major acts of violence, mass shootings, things of that nature that move toward that true crime. You know, we're trying to understand someone's motives, and it's a lot harder in the moment. We don't really talk about motive we do now, but we didn't talk about motive in the moment. At the time we talked about this is so shocking because they were still very shocking. Now it seems like we're living in a moment where we're all reading on these things, listening to podcasts, doing all these things and trying to figure out how to avoid them, which is a very different sort of frame of mind than the kind of just reportage that we might have seen when they first, you know, became big public events.
It's also fascinating because I think came from the same space that you did, Cari, which is I don't actually remember hearing about this before. And I think it is because when we tell the story of mass gun violence in the United States, today we often start that story with Columbine in 1999. And for those of us who were born in the late 70s and the early 80s, that's the thing that's kind of seared in our memory. Whereas for people who are just a little bit older, this would have been one of the most horrifying public events in living memory.
Absolutely. And I was thinking, Kelly and I, as native Texans, Killeen, the Luby's massacre is probably the one that is the first one that we remember hearing about, right? And that was 91. But there's also a school shooting in here. There's the Cleveland Elementary School shooting in Stockton in 89. So, it's kind of fascinating. Our timelines get pushed around in very different ways. And depending on who you are and from where you stand, which one is your first one that you remember, there's a formative moment there.
Yeah. I mean, what's so wild about this entire incident is that as the gunman enters the McDonald's and he's just killing people wholesale, I mean, very few people have attempts to escape. It is horrific violence, especially of young people. But it just sort of boggles my mind again how long it took for people to get rescued, how many people were able to die in a short amount of time. I mean, this is a narrative that gets played out over and over again in a lot of these incidences. And when you just see such great carnage, usually against vulnerable people, be it elderly people or young people, and always the question, not just about motivation, but also about like delays. How long does it take to stop someone from doing something like this?
And it was about an hour with the gunman inside shooting people before an employee managed to escape through the basement and inform a SWAT team that he was alone. That was one of the big questions. Was he alone or did he have hostages or so forth? And finally the SWAT team was informed he is alone. He does not have hostages. He's just executing people. And finally they went in and a sharpshooter was told to take him out. And it was 77 minutes after he first started opening fire. So, I guess we can start to do the list, the horrific list, in which this story feels like it just contains that checklist of all the things we've gotten used to. So one is that delayed response. What else comes to mind, Cari, in this story as something that like, gosh, even way back when we were starting to see the seeds of this stuff?
I think for me, the thing that is the sort of seed moment for me is what he was carrying. You think about the kinds of guns that mass shooting perpetrators use. And of course, the news report says he had a semi-automatic pistol, a semi-automatic rifle, and then was it a shotgun? Do you remember, Jody? Yeah, a shotgun. And, you think about like we're used to now, we think about when we read the news reports, we think, oh, he was carrying a semi-automatic rifle. But the Luby shooting was 2 semi-automatic pistols. And so it's kind of fascinating to think about what amount of firepower, right, is brought into these places. And that's also very much common and consistent over time. It's a change in the things that people are carrying into public spaces, right, particularly when they're intending to make mass violence happen. And that's definitely consistent. The delay, I think maybe the delay is consistent in a way, but also I think I would give maybe a little bit of grace here to think about this was like new, these police officers that were like, what is going on here? And now I think what makes us so angry today is that they happen over and over and over again. And we now see a delay and we're like, wait, this is not the first time this has happened. Y'all should be prepared for this. Right. And so that I think is the thing that's also kind of fascinating to think about what has and hasn't changed over time. Yeah.
And that his gun was legal. Is that correct? He could legally.
Yeah, it was illegal. Yeah. Yes. It was legal. And even, this was, even if we think about the 94 assault weapons ban, which happened, 10 years later, the guns that he was carrying would have all still been legal after 94 because the provisions of that bill did not touch guns that were already in private hands. Right. Which is a sort of a recurring problem too, right? They're not retroactive. They're rarely retroactive if they are. And so even the Uzi he was carrying, which was listed by name in the assault weapons ban, would have still been legal.
I think the other commonality is the idea of an attack like this happening in a public recreational space, right? That idea that a place that you've gone for fun, whether it's McDonald's or a movie theater or a parade, that those are the places that become the scenes of these devastating crimes. And, you know, at this point, when it's much less common, I don't remember growing up and my mom being scared to take us to a McDonald's. But when these happen with more frequency, suddenly those public places and recreational spaces get marked by this kind of violence and threaded through with a kind of, could it happen to us here?
Yeah. There's no safe space.
The other elements that feel so resonant, domestic violence. I mean, this man had number of incidents in which he abused his wife and child. He was a veteran, seemed to talk with his family and at times reach out to mental health professionals about his PTSD. And so, you know, obviously in 1984, we see this is the wake of Vietnam. He talked about Vietnam during the incident itself, apparently. So, you know, all those things that I guess we maybe call now red flags and red flags that we should see, particularly then when you talk about red flags in relation to getting access to the guns that you know, as you discussed, Cari. But all that was part of this story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, you know, the other thing that's kind of surprising, or that always is a bit surprising, I think, to think about, is that most gun violence actually happens behind closed doors. You know, we see these public acts and they're terrifying. And of course, they make us terrified to be in public. But that's still not the site of most gun violence. And, you know, that domestic violence component here is very key, because most gun violence happens inside of a home or behind closed doors. And so, you know, it's a very different, I hate to use the word paradigm shift, but it is a bit of a paradigm shift to think about now how we see it in public. So now we're scared in public when still most gun violence happens at home or in private places.
Yeah.
The mental health aspect of it is still very much a part of the conversation as well. You know, there were victims that said that the gunman was sipping soda from people's drinks and dancing to the music and very much acting in a way that signaled that he was not mentally well. And those are one of the first questions I think we often ask is, you know, is this person mentally ill? Like that becomes sort of like the catch-all explanation for this sort of heinous crime.
And, you know, this man had apparently just, I think, in the days before reached out to mental health providers and asked for help, and they had not returned his phone call, and in the interim, he commits this act. This is tricky territory, and I'm curious, Cari and others, you know, kind of how you grapple with this, because the conversation about mental health and mental illness related to all this gun violence, you know, I think generally people who want to address guns themselves say, you know, retreating to a question of mental health feels like it's scapegoating or it's skirting the real issue here. But also, you know, it is an issue here. It is part of this. And so I don't know, just how do you put that into the mix, Cari, and how do you see that play out in terms of hopefully a productive policy conversation that addresses all of the things that are going on in incidents like this?
Yeah, I mean, mental health has an ability to clarify, but also to obfuscate. And I think it gets used in both ways, right? When we think about mental health care and access to good mental health care as integral to solving some gun violence issues, it's absolutely the correct avenue to work in, right? Most people die by suicide. Most gun deaths are still by suicide, which is absolutely about access to good quality mental health care when you need it, right? So that's, in a way, exceptionally clarifying. But also focusing on these details about the individual's mental state themselves is obfuscating, because it allows us to say, well, that guy was just having a day, right? Or he was crazy, or whatever that is. And it narrows our policy decisions at that point, because we say, well, that's an individual. You can't do anything about the person's state of mind. That's that, you know, that's the guns don't kill people. People don't kill people. That's the kernel of that sort of truism that, you know, that we hear over and over again. And so it works in two different directions. And I think if we think about policy, we have to be really thoughtful about what is our end goal so that we understand the means by which we are making some policy, right? If our end goal is to solve the bigger crisis, which is suicide by gun, then mental health care and access to good quality mental health care when you need it is a really important tool for solving that question. If our question is about public acts of gun violence, then we should probably be thinking in some other directions, right? Because it is also true that it's just so easy to get your hands on a gun in the United States of America, in all the states.
So as we wrap up, I mean, what was your sense of the policy and political conversation that broke out from this? I mean, you know, we mentioned you study the NRA, you look back at some of the reporting, and obviously, Nikki, like, this is your political sort of time frame, or starting to get into your political time frame as well. So, like, what was the response, as best we could tell, both within the political community and the gun community?
So it cuts a few ways, and Cari can talk a little bit about what's happening with the NRA, which is shifting in a more radical direction in the late 70s and into the 1980s. But the big gun conversation, to the extent that there was one, I mean, there were all sorts of local regulations that had been passed in the late 60s and in the 1970s, in part because there had been so many political assassinations, right? Just a few years earlier, President Reagan had been shot by a would-be assassin. And so there was a lot of conversation around security around presidents. Reagan himself would become an advocate for gun regulation. Not only had he signed it in California, which was we'll save that issue for another day. When we get to 93 and 94 with the passage of the Brady Bill and the federal assault weapons ban, which is part of the larger omnibus crime bill, Reagan comes out in support of both of those pieces of legislation. And what you see is he's really at odds with his party, which is increasingly, at that point, not entirely captured by the NRA. But the NRA is going to focus much more on trying to move the Republican Party in an anti-gun regulation direction, contra Ronald Reagan, who's writing op-eds saying you should support the Brady Bill, in part because it was named after his press secretary who was shot during that assassination attempt. You should support the federal assault weapons ban. He would be increasingly, though not at the time, increasingly an outlier within the Republican Party.
Well, and Reagan's position is also really it's personally interesting, because after he was shot in 80, he basically doubled down and said, no, this is, we will not be working to do anything to pass any sort of restrictive gun legislation after his shooting. And so you're looking, I think, too, at a man who is making some, he's making a change. He's having a change of heart, mind, whatever you'd like to call it, over time. What was happening actually was before in Congress at that time was in 79 was the first McClure-Volkmer bill, which then was introduced a couple more times and became the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act, which relaxed some of the provisions of the 68 Gun Control Act. And Reagan supported that. He supported it on the campaign trail. He supported it when it came through Congress. But at the same time, there was also a push for an end to armor-piercing bullets, some restrictions on armor-piercing bullets, the so-called cop killer bullets, that was happening at the same time. And so you see the NRA the NRA is actually talking about McClure-Volkmer. Let's get this thing passed. But they talk about the first iteration of the armor-piercing bullets ban didn't get through. It was withdrawn. And so, they're celebrating these successes in sort of all different directions, but there's no real cohesive talk because, again, I think because this was so early, right? Yeah. This was just the Whitman shooting in 62, and then you've got this one in 84, and then 89 and 91. So this is a moment where, these things still seem like aberrations. And so there's not a large conversation about public violence other than against, prominent figures like Nicole was talking about, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. That gave us, so they sort of pushed the public into action and really pushed Congress into action that resulted in 68. So, it's a very different time frame.
It would have felt like overreach, right?
Yeah. There's this sort of, what is the overreach? Where is the appropriate amount of action here? Yeah.
We should have you back on to do some sort of specific NRA history and some moments in there. But, out of curiosity, is there a shooting that does feel like the moment at which the NRA at least has to feel some pressure and has to address this and can't just do what they did here and basically not write about it and not talk about it?
Well, Columbine was huge, and Columbine was huge for a lot of reasons, but also because the NRA's annual convention was just up the road. just afterwards. And so I think that it became more, Nicole can definitely talk to this, that the landscape of media change really made a difference in the way that we perceive these actions and who actually has to talk about it in the wake thereof, right? But I think Columbine was just it was televised. It was such a shock, and then of course they were coming to town right afterwards. So that was one where they just could not ignore having a conversation. They had been, they put out statements around boobies and around the Ruby Ridge issue and around Waco and around, and so there had been sort of small things, but I think the first large one that I can think of was Columbine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will leave it on that note. Cari Babitzke of Boston University, thank you so much. This is really fantastic insight. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks again for having me.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia from PRX.